This is They Create Worlds, episode 223, D&D and Video Games, 2nd edition.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host Alex.
Hello.
We return to our look at the horrors and devilry that is D&D. But last time we didn't really talk about D&D so much as wargaming and miniatures and fanzines and all of these people getting together, some sort of convention called Gen Con. It was madness, and we didn't even really talk about Dungeons and Dragons. There was some role-playing in there too, but it hasn't really come together into a nice slushy of joy.
Yeah, that's right. You know, as we talked about at the end of the last episode, I mean, that's really because RPGs, role-playing games, were something so different from anything that came before in games that there are a lot of different threads you have to pull on, a lot of different areas you have to go into to truly come to understand how we got to this brand new type of game where it's just a bunch of people sitting around arguing about what they're going to do and occasionally throwing some dice with strange numbers of sides on them to resolve conflicts that can't be resolved just through talking through things with the player and the referees. I mean, that's truly completely different from any kind of game that came before. And so, not surprisingly, this didn't just appear out of whole cloth one day in Gygax and Arneson's heads or something. I mean, there's so many different threads that you have to pull on to get that full story of the creation. Yeah, so that means that there was a lot of ground to cover. So we kind of got ourselves to the point where D&D is about ready to actually happen in the last episode. And today we'll go into the kind of more, this is how D&D itself was created now that all of that background is done. And then chart kind of the initial rise and spread of D&D as well. And then we'll end with a third part showing how this transitioned very quickly into the computer game space and became such a major influence on the video game industry as a result. Just as a reminder, this is a 3-parter that we are live streaming the recording of as we do once a year.
Hi, chat. Hi, Twitch. Hello, people.
Indeed.
I might even make it so this does Twitch and YouTube at the same time eventually. Never got that far. I was going to for this one.
Very scary. We may be a little more distracted than usual. There may be slightly more tangenting than usual. Jeffrey definitely spent more time crying as he tried to sort out the stuff that is just for the stream from the stuff that actually needs to go into an episode. Editing Jeffrey, if Editing Jeffrey were in charge, he would never let us do these, but we lock him in the foot for the duration of the recordings and only let him out afterwards. Jeffrey knows what I'm talking about. Nobody else does. Nobody else does, but that's what happens when you're friends with each other for 30 plus years. You have your own lore, some of which becomes podcast lore, some of which does not.
It's all a mystery. No one knows.
There may be a few times where we're referencing something that happens in chat or a few more weird tangents than normal, just because we are live streaming these. And if you were not able to attend that live stream, or if you did and are asking yourself, did that really happen? Or was it just one giant fever dream? Which is a very plausible, reasonable question to be asking about this entire affair. We will have this live stream posted as well for people to peruse, which, you know, it'll be a long one. We're in the middle of it, so I don't know how long, but we're usually talking 8 or 9 hours of material with just a couple of breaks in there.
All right. We have all the elements of D&D. We sort of have a proto-D&D with Bromsteins, and some Gary Gygax guy is looking at making some miniatures tie into that or something. How do we throw this all into a blender and turn it into this wonderful smorgasbord of D&D?
Well, how we do that depends on who you ask and whether they're an Arneson supporter or a Gygax supporter. But we're going to mostly sidestep that little controversy and try to report the facts as close to what may possibly be the truth as we can get them. There is a lot of controversy there between the Gygax camp and the Arneson camp about who did what, which of course devolved into lawsuits at one point as well over royalties. You know, we've been kind of covering these two sides fairly equally. I mean, I have no idea in terms of amount of time given. We've probably covered one side more than the other, but we've been trying to keep up with the Arnesons and the Gygaxes of the world simultaneously here. Because really, it doesn't happen without either of them. Now, we spent a lot of time in the first episode talking about kind of the origin of even the concept of role-playing. Certainly that came entirely from the Arneson camp, from that Twin Cities Military Miniatures group. We looked at Wesley and his fascination with Totten, his fascination with referees and the idea that anything can be attempted, and how that translated into his Braunstein game, in which you had a traditional military miniatures kind of skirmish as the overarching theme, but you had many players doing things that had nothing at all to do with leading metal armies on the field whatsoever. So, you know, that whole side of it comes entirely from the Arneson camp. Like, there would not be such a thing as an RPG without Arneson and Wesley and other members of that group, Carr and Kuntz and all sorts of others, doing whatever it was that they were doing. Yes, now we're almost to the point where you can seduce the General Crater, for sure. We got from fighting the general to seducing the general in the last episode. Now we'll get from seducing the general to, I don't know, murdering the general and looting his body. That's all that D&D groups do, right? Is like murder things and take their stuff.
Sure. If we're just a bunch of murder hobos or something. Not that I've had a bunch of murder hobos happily go and slaughter everything in a dungeon. Do we want to understand what's going on here, or do we just want to hobo it? And then everyone's just like, we are just murder hoboing. And then we're doomed. We're doomed. And I just go, there's combat.
I mean, the one guy or gal or whatever it is that we saved that one time did end up to be working to bring about a new darkness afterwards. So, you know, understanding the situation didn't necessarily work out that well for us, whereas we've had a lot less evil empowering itself since we just started killing everything. No questions asked, Jeffrey.
Fair enough.
Essa Molivas, Can I Seduce the General was the original Can I Pet the Dog? Absolutely. Love that. You know, from the Arneson camp comes that role-playing side, but Arneson was never a great codifier of rules. Obviously, Wesley had done some rules codification. He had taken Strategos and modified it into Strategos N for the group, for their Napoleonic campaigns. Arneson is not so much a system builder. In his Grand Napoleonic campaign, he's largely using rules that were adapted from other people. Yeah, Arneson did, Strategos C, but I don't know that those rules are as well regarded as Strategos N, quite frankly. Ethan, you know, it's not to say that Arneson never wrote rules. It's just that he was never as focused on plotting out all the nuts and bolts of a system himself. I mean, obviously, he'd done rule systems before, and he collaborated with Gygax on doing Don't Give Up the Ship. But again, he collaborated with Gygax on doing Don't Give Up the Ship. As Arneson is taking over this Braunstein style of play, he is coming up with lots of rules. I mean, it's not that he doesn't develop rules, but he's very much here's a basic framework of what this world is like. But I'm not going to come up with specifics for this, that, or the other thing until it's actually needed in the game. He's more of the referee than he is the rule maker. You know, it's the Totten principle. Anything can be attempted, and your referee's going to tell you if it's possible or not. Arneson makes up rules, and he tries to keep them fairly consistent. And when his players ask to do something they hasn't thought up yet, he's going to come up with rules for it. But he's not the type to just sit down at the beginning of a game or beginning of a project and be like, I am going to try to define a complete system of rules that can be applied to this scenario. Gygax is way more that. But Gygax isn't necessarily an original thinker. Gygax is the ultimate collaborator. Almost everything significant that he did came through collaboration, and there were very few things where he was the one that had the germ of the system. It's always someone else had the germ of that system. And then Gygax is like, let's collaborate, let's codify. And he'll take what that other person did and he will flesh it out to the hilt. I mean, he creates rules too. It's not like he doesn't create anything. But he's the guy that likes taking the germ of the idea and taking the initial thoughts on how something works and building a complete system around them. Now, he's not always perfect at building a complete system. We'll see how incomplete D&D is as a system when it's first created, believe me. We also really wouldn't have D&D without Gygax either, because Gygax was never going to come up with the, because the Arneson people are like, well, Gygax just took Arneson's idea and stole it, not stole it because they were collaborators, but stole the credit for it over time. He was generous in crediting Arneson early. He became less and less generous. The more businesslike TSR became, the less open to crediting Arneson Gygax was, basically. The Arneson camp are all very much like, well, Arneson and Wesley and all these people, they invented role-playing. Gygax did not invent role-playing, so it's ridiculous for Gygax to call himself a father of tabletop role-playing. The Gygax folk will say, okay, fine, but who published it? How did that rule system get out there? Arneson didn't found Tactical Studies rules, despite what certain placards at the Strong that I've been trying to get corrected still say. Arneson didn't print those rules. Arneson didn't have Gen Con. Arneson didn't run games at Gen Con and write a million articles in various fanzines to publicize the game. It's like Arneson had a stack of notes. I'm just talking about what the Gygax camp would say. I'm not saying what I would say. Arneson just had a stack of notes on some fun little homebrew thing he was doing at home. And you didn't have a game until Gygax wrote it all down, published it, and publicized it. Both sides, in my opinion, we're not going to wade too far into it, but we need to give our opinion on it because it's going to color how we cover the creation. Both sides of it have a little bit of a point, and both sides of it have a little bit of truth within what they're saying. Gygax would have never created the RPG himself. There's nothing in Gygax's history to this point that shows him to be a leader in anything. He experiences something and then he gets wrapped up in it. He experienced board war games and had the general, and so he started writing into the general. He experienced Siege of Bodenberg at Gen Con, and so suddenly he's all about military miniatures. He sees Jeff Perrin's medieval rules, which we're going to get into, so he creates Chainmail. And he sees what Arneson's doing and writes up Dungeons & Dragons. Like, in every case, it's always a reaction to something else that's always going on. So Gygax was never going to have that original thought. You know what? Role-playing games. That was clearly Arneson and Wesley. On the other hand, role-playing games would have probably never left the confines of the Twin Cities Military Miniatures group and other individual fandoms that Arneson may have mingled with at places like Gen Con or other conventions without Gygax being like, let's create something comprehensive out of this. Let's collaborate together to create something comprehensive and publish it. So, yeah, Arneson invented role-playing, but 300 people were going to know about it and do anything with it without Gygax. I think it's fair to say.
So really, it's the culmination of both of their works and efforts together that leads to this, not just one or the other. And the fact that one or the other want to take sole responsibility is really disingenuous to the entire situation.
Exactly. Each side thinks that their contributions were more important. And that's an argument you can go round and round with forever. What's more important, coming up with something or making it mainstream? Who's more important, Ralph Baer or Nolan Bushnell? Who's more important, Nikola Tesla or Thomas Edison? I mean, you can go round and round on these kind of debates on anything, and I don't think it's helpful. Certainly not helpful to what we do here at They Create Worlds.
That's sort of the problem we ran into with the 100 most influential games. Which one do we want to do? The one who did it first or the one who popularized it?
Exactly. And yeah, Tiger Wolf Games says Jobs versus Woz, which, yeah, exact same thing as well. Another great example. I don't have any interest in parceling out, like a lawyer in a court case parceling out fault. Carl knows what I'm talking about. I'm not interested in parceling out percentages of credit for Dungeons and Dragons. I just want to say that both sides make incredibly valid points about important contributions. They exaggerate them, but they make good points, and that I truly don't believe you get Dungeons & Dragons without both Arneson and Gygax. You do not get RPGs as we know them today without both of those people. This is me not getting into the debate, Ethan. I know what you're saying, and you're right. I mean, of course you're right. And everyone knew this was going to happen, because you've all listened to at least a couple of dozen They Create Worlds episodes. You knew when I said I wasn't going to get into something that I was going to get into it. It's like that could practically be a TCW meme. I'm not wading deep into the controversy. I'm not going to try to say this was more important from Arneson, this was more important from Gygax, like it's 50% this, 20% this, you know.
We're not getting into the weeds here. We're going over here's the controversy as it is. If you want to delve into it more, each respective camp has their stuff out there on it.
I know it's been mentioned in the chat, but I should mention on here as well, shout out that one of our viewers right now is Tranternator, Carl Kuras, who I co-host on his podcast, the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, which takes my statement of, boy, does They Create Worlds go on way too long a tangent sometimes, and says, hold my beer.
I keep Alex sane under 2 hours, typically. Carl goes 2 hours? Meh, that's a jaunt in the park for us.
But I love doing the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine with Carl. It's a deep dive on all the major headlines of the month in 30 and 40-year jumps. We're a little behind on getting it out in the same calendar month, but right now we are working our way through 1984 and 1994. It's great fun, and I consider Carl a close, dear friend. So if you love our podcast, do check him out as well. And thank him for being here with all of the crazy time difference over from Deutschland to support us here as well. And, of course, our good friend Ethan Johnson, friend of the show, makes cameos there as well as the Department of Corrections and occasionally joins us in long form for some very special episodes as well. Having said all of that about this Arneson-Gygax divide, it's time to bring these two elements together into this final creation, because you really have two things that are going on at once. You have the Arneson group that are falling in love with this new kind of miniatures gaming, which is less about controlling huge armies as it is about inhabiting characters. Sometimes those characters' job is still to control huge armies. But there's this idea that you can have objectives in the game outside of military conquest, and not every player in the game necessarily needs to be there to control a military force. Some of them could be other players in the scenario with other objectives and other means of achieving victory. Then on the other side, you have Gary Gygax, who has recently fallen hard for military miniatures gaming, having before that been primarily a board wargamer. And like any convert, has become a true believer and a crusader, pun intended, for medieval and ancient wargaming, going so far as to found a new subgroup of the International Federation of Wargamers, the Castle and Crusades Society, with its own periodical, the Domesday Book, named after the famous census book compiled by William the Conqueror upon his conquest of England. Why do I know that? Because I'm a nerd. I'm a history nerd loser streaming from his parents' basement. Dad, stop! I'll do that when the stream's over! It can wait! In case there are any latecomers to stream, I am not in my usual location, in my own domicile, which I pay rent on all by myself like a big boy, but my father is having some medical work done here, and I am back home helping out, but this all popped up after we had announced our live stream date, so couldn't leave you all hanging. Brought all my sound equipment with me and am broadcasting from my parents' basement, as any good Twitch streamer should. And is very interested in developing a new set of medieval miniatures rules, because that's not really the sweet spot. That's not where most people are doing their wargaming. It's primarily Napoleonic miniatures at this time, maybe a little bit of World War II miniatures and Civil War miniatures, but it's really primarily the Napoleonic Wars that people like doing. There isn't a lot out there for that medieval period. In the midst of all of this, Gary Gygax also establishes his own local miniatures wargaming group, the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association, made up of some local folks, some his age, some younger, that are congregating in his basement. And he's been having some employment issues throughout this period as well, and kind of feels like this may be his last kind of final chance to put some effort into trying to break into more of the game creation business, which is something he enjoys doing, but is all very much a hobbyist kind of thing. So it turns out that one of the members of the LGTSA is a guy named Jeff Perrin, who shares a fascination with medieval and ancient wargaming and has been tinkering with his own set of rules. So just like what will happen with Dungeons & Dragons a little later, Gygax is like, that's great. I really want a new medieval rule set. Let's work together and polish this up, what you've already done, and find some place to release this as a real product. That's what they do. You know, Perrin's kind of made a start on it. Gygax takes what Perrin's already done and kind of organizes it a bit, adds a little touch here and there. He also has fallen in this time period with a hobby shop owner by the name of Don Lowry, who is starting his own imprint, Gygax Games, in order to publish things like miniatures rule sets. Again, as we talked about in the last episode, oftentimes there's quite a link between hobby shops and these small independent imprints, because rule sets like that are relatively cheap to produce, because we're not talking about doing, you know, the highest levels of quality. So they're relatively cheap to produce and have the potential to spur miniatures sales at the hobby shop, because you put out a miniatures rule set and then, spoiler alert, you need miniatures to be able to play the game. So he's starting his imprint, Gygax Games, and an interesting little tidbit here. At this time, Mr. Lowry is actually ensconced in a little town, Jeffrey, called Belleville, Illinois.
Wait, what?
That's right. Lowry's hobby shop and the original location of Gygax Games is Belleville, Illinois, which is where Jeffrey and I are right now. Jeffrey is technically in unincorporated St. Clair County, completely surrounded by Belleville, and I am technically 2 towns over, but we are essentially in Belleville. We are essentially in the place where Lowry was, who published Chainmail.
Wow, that's kind of crazy to think. Which one of the game stores locally is it?
I think he ran it out of his house, and he wasn't here long. He ended up relocating to Maine, which actually is the precipitating event that causes all of this to fall apart, which is why Gygax needs to found his own company. So he wasn't here long, and I think he ran it out of his house. It wasn't like on Main Street or something. But yeah, a little local connection for the two of us here.
Keep in mind, Alex and I grew up here more or less a good chunk of our lives, through our teenage years and the majority of our adolescence, and then Alex ran off to Germany or something for a little bit.
As people do.
Had to go hunt him down and make sure he was still alive at some point.
I was.
Bonus points, he was alive.
Exactly. They published this rule set, Chainmail, as they call it, through Gygax Games and Lowry, who has this as an adjunct to his hobby shop. Gygax, as what he calls an afterthought, which he's probably downplaying for some very good reasons that we'll get to, but as an afterthought, adds in some rules for fantasy campaigns as an appendix to this thing, where he takes creatures and races primarily from the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and the concept of heroes and wizards and superheroes that are one-to-one figures. Most military miniatures games are obviously run on, 10-to-1 or 100-to-1 or whatever, where a single figure represents many, many troops. Because obviously when you're talking about armies of tens of thousands maneuvering against each other, you can't put tens of thousands of miniatures on a ping pong table in your basement. Nor can you paint them all, even if you could fit them all on your ping pong table. So there's always an abstraction of scale. One-to-one is very rare. It's not unprecedented. There was a World War II system, Modern Miniatures Wargaming or something like that, by a guy named Corns, that actually did one-to-one. And there were a few other examples of one-to-one. But for the most part, you didn't have that. For the most part, chainmail didn't either. Now, he did have one-to-one rules for sieges in there because sieges were small enough that you could do that one-to-one. But in general, that was also on a scale. But the heroic campaign, while it still had some units that were on a scale of like 10-to-1 or whatever, had wizards, heroes, and superheroes that were actually one-to-one hero units that were stronger, had more powers, and could impact the game in a very real way. It's interesting, why would there be fantasy rules? There's a couple of things going on here. First of all, J.R.R. Tolkien has just hit big in the United States. Just hit big. The Lord of the Rings was originally published in 3 volumes in the middle of the 1950s in Britain. It had come over to the United States, but it really wasn't that popular, but it suddenly became very popular with the counterculture crowd in the mid-1960s after a series of unauthorized paperback versions were released that were much cheaper. The Lord of the Rings had some themes about pastoralism and how nature was under assault by the evil forces of industry, and this good versus evil thing, and this idea that a small group of guerrillas, in a way, could impact the world and push back evil. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that really resonated in there with the counterculture crowd. It started achieving major popularity by the late 1960s. People wearing Frodo Lives pins and all of this kind of stuff. Leonard Nimoy doing a little song about a little hobbit named Bilbo Baggins, which I only mention because now Jeff is contractually obligated to put that in the show notes.
Oh, I could do something even more horrible. I could throw it on the stream.
Omega Number says, my older kiddo is playing D&D right now at this very moment. That's great. Of course, Crater earlier on mentioned that he won't be able to stay for the whole thing because his D&D group will be playing tonight. It's really become such a phenomenon. Obviously, I think it's fair to say we're all nerds here, but it's grown so far beyond that. So many people play it these days and enjoy it, or play other types of games similar to it, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
It really is. Especially with the streaming era and the ability to have actual play podcast and streams of D&D so that people can really experience that thing vicariously and really learn it and really enjoy it and just find a group that really resonates with them and they want to follow it, and then they go, oh, well, this is more fun than I really understood. I'll go make my own game with my own friends and have a lot of fun.
You don't have any friends. Nobody likes you. Speaking of Tolkien. So, Tolkien achieved great popularity in the late 1960s, and because of that popularity, a lot of other fantasy was riding in its wake. So, contrary to some popular belief, Tolkien didn't invent fantasy, even though a lot of the modern underpinnings of fantasy we owe to Tolkien, and certainly the enormous popularity stems from Tolkien. He didn't invent it. And after Tolkien gained such popularity, then Robert E. Howard's Conan books started to be reprinted. Fritz Lieber started getting more of a cachet again. Then other authors that had started to write in the 60s as well, like Poul Anderson and Michael Moorcock, were finding new audiences as well. So there was kind of this entire fantasy genre that was suddenly becoming popular at this exact moment. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap between science fiction and fantasy fandom and wargaming fandom. There is a Venn diagram there. The Venn diagram is not a circle, but there is a lot of overlap. They tend to attract some of the same types of people. And so there was a growing fandom for this fantasy stuff within some wargaming crowds as well. Obviously, there are big battles in Tolkien. The Hobbit has the Battle of the Five Armies. And Lord of the Rings has the Siege at the Hornburg and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields and all sorts of other stuff that's referenced in passing elsewhere and in the appendices. There's a lot of epic war going on there that logically could be transitioned into rules. There's a lot of this going on. And then the other thing that specifically inspired Gygax, and this is a John Peterson discovery, because a lot of this history was buried in fanzines that like 5 people in the country still had copies of. John Peterson's great contribution, I mean, he writes great books too, but his truly great contribution was that he tracked down all of these obscure little fanzines and read them all and discovered a narrative that had just been lost due to a lack of accessibility. Discovered all sorts of happenings that we didn't know about. There was a guy named Leonard Pat, not to be confused with Fletcher Pratt with an R, the naval rules guy. A guy named Leonard Pat, who released in this tiny little fanzine in 1970 a set of rules he called Rules for Middle-earth, which was attempting to adapt the creatures and characters and setting of Tolkien into wargaming. I think part of the reason that Gygax didn't want to talk too much about his afterthought fantasy rules is because it turns out most of them came from Pat. He didn't just lift them whole, he made some changes of his own. But it's very clear, and you can read Peterson if you want a point-by-point, blow-by-blow list of the similarities that are way too similar to each other for two people to have come up with in parallel. One of those things maybe is a coincidence, but like a half dozen or more of those very specific things, yeah, no way two people came up with those in parallel. So a set of rules already existed in an obscure fanzine, and Gygax, who himself was a voracious reader, he's always said that he was never as fond of Tolkien, though he also always said that after a lawsuit from the Tolkien estate made him change the names of things like Ints and Hobbits to names like Tree Ints and Halflings. Gygax became very much the businessman and self-promoter, and I wonder how much of his downplaying of Tolkien is due to the fact that the Tolkien estate sued him. He claims he wasn't as big a fan of Tolkien, but I mean, he had read Lieber and Howard and all of these people growing up, Vance. He was a great fan of that literature. I'm sure when he saw these rules, that kind of inflamed his imagination as well, and he was like, I'm making some medieval rules anyway. This is a great little addendum to put in there. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why he never goes into great detail about why he decided to do it. The other reason he didn't highlight them so much was a more practical one. There was a big divide in the wargaming community. There were people in that community that were like, if it isn't as realistic as possible to the real world, then it is not something we should be wargaming. And please leave the orcs and the Ents and the Balrogs and the dragons. There's our first dragon mention, 43 minutes into the second episode's recording. Keep those out of my wargaming. So it was kind of a little treat thrown in there at the end for the fans, but it wasn't something that he necessarily wanted to hang the entire system on because he knew that that would get some pushbacks from the purists. He did. He added these rules in, largely based on Pat's Rules for Middle-earth, so that you could do fantasy campaigns too, and some of the characters in that were one-for-one super powerful characters that had additional abilities and could lay waste to large groups of ordinary soldiers in a way that you normally did not find in a miniatures wargame. At the same time this is happening, Arneson is getting sick of his Napoleonic campaign because there's dissension in the ranks. First, it's a huge thing to manage because there's like 26 or something like that players. They're spread all over the country. Like Gygax's group is also participating in it in Lake Geneva. It's not just local to the Twin Cities. It's a big headache. It's a lot to keep track of. And some of the players don't even like the way he's doing it. And there's been dissension in the ranks. So it's like, this is just too much headache. I'm getting out of this. I'm going to do something smaller and more intimate, like those Braunstein games that Wesley and others have been running. And that, of course, Arneson was participating in. I mean, he was a player in the original Braunstein because it's all part of the same group. I've been on a Howard kick recently. I've been on a Hammer horror kick recently. I'm going to set it in this great, miserable, boggy, marshy, medieval place under siege by evil forces. By the Egg of Coot, to be exact. Basically transports the players from the Napoleonic campaign, the local ones that are going to be part of this new thing. He basically transports them in whole cloth. He kind of aligns it a little bit with Gygax's Castles and Crusades Society because one element of this society, echoing this idea that the early wargaming clubs had, that you had fiefdoms and members going back to even the Spectre days, like this person has been the Spectre guy conquering Virginia, like you have these own personal fiefdoms as part of this thing. Gygax, as part of the Castle and Crusade Society, has already been creating essentially what would become the Great Kingdom of Greyhawk fame. So they kind of attach Blackmoor to the Great Kingdom as well. So he's kind of aligning in that way, but he's doing his own thing in this very marshy, boggy, icky place because it's, I think in part because it's about as far away as he can get from Napoleonic wargaming while still somehow maintaining a space in the realm of wargaming. So he needs rules for that. At about the same time this is starting up in 1979 is when Chainmail is getting published. And of course, they're in correspondence. I mean, he sees advanced copies of it even before it's published because Gygax and Arneson have become full-on friends and collaborators by this point. He adapts the Chainmail rules for use in his Blackmoor campaign. Now, in later years, Arneson said, we tried using Chainmail, and we used it for a bit, and it just didn't work very well. So I actually mostly redid my rules entirely from scratch using another naval game involving ironclads that I had come up with. I have to wonder if he isn't de-emphasizing Gygax somewhat in the same way that Gygax likes de-emphasizing Arneson because they became bitter rivals and had multiple lawsuits going at each other. I think it's fair to say that, certainly Arneson was never just going to use Chainmail. I'm sure he was starting to modify it and bring other things in as well. But Chainmail ends up being at least the initial basis for resolving combat in the Blackmoor game, though Arneson may have eventually deviated from it. The thing that Blackmoor got to that earlier Braunsteins didn't is every single Braunstein before this had been kind of a self-contained game. You were given a scenario. Ethan is saying, the 1972 letter says he used, quote, fairly minor modifications to Chainmail. Yeah, that's before they hated each other and is probably a little closer to the truth. As Ethan also says in the chat, they were definitely using multiple systems because there was multiple types of combat going on. It's not like all of Blackmoor was based around Chainmail, but I do think that Arneson probably, at the risk of wading into the great debate again, I do think that Arneson probably in later years deliberately downplayed the use of Chainmail in Blackmoor due to this rivalry. Peterson is probably a little bit on the pro-Gygax side, so I guess you may have to watch Peterson a little bit when it comes to the debate between the two, but Peterson definitely does not appear to give any credence to Arneson's statements in more recent days in the 2000s, shortly before he died, and definitely prefers to go back to the correspondence that they were having at that time before the enmity developed. Whether Peterson is showing a bias there or not, that's beyond the scope of this podcast. That's just to say it's complicated. But regardless, Chainmail was being used to some extent within the Blackmoor campaign for combat resolution. As I was saying, though, the thing that was different is like previous Braunsteins, which had been in a variety of settings. There'd been a Western one called Brownstone. There'd apparently been one that took place in a Banana Republic deal in South America. There were multiple Braunsteins that were played, but each one was in itself self-contained. You had a scenario, you had a set of characters, and yeah, you might not resolve the whole thing in a single day, but it was a single campaign with specific objectives for the characters to reach, and then it was over with. Then you moved on to another Braunstein when that one was over. Well, the first session of Blackmoor was so fun to all the players that they wanted to keep going. They wanted to continue to do this thing, and they wanted to use the same characters to do it. They didn't want to start a new scenario. Arneson came up with the unique idea, which had a basis in the victory points of war games. It's not like it was completely out of whole cloth, but had the unique idea that, okay, if we're going to keep using the same characters, let's have a progression for it. In war games, you had the concept of the war game campaign, which is where you would fight multiple battles and you would win victory points in those battles, and then you would tally up the victory points at the end to see who won the campaign. There was an idea of progression there. Of course, even the Braunsteins used victory points as a method of tallying up how each individual character did it, succeed in their objective. So there are already points running around even in Braunsteins. But his idea is, let's use these points, instead of calling them victory points, we'll call them experience points. And by accumulating experience points, you will eventually go up in level and you will improve your abilities. He probably took a little bit of inspiration on this from Chainmail as well. Now, Chainmail did not have experience points and levels or any of that stuff. That invention is 100% Arneson. Chainmail did have heroes and superheroes, different levels of hero, different with one more powerful than the other. Chainmail did not have rules to transition from one to the other. There was no character progression in Chainmail. But it may be that seeing this idea of having different levels, different powers of heroes laid out in Chainmail might have been part of what he was thinking of when he came up with a system of progression. That's one of the things that set Blackmoor apart, is now instead of just having a single Braunstein session, a single Blackmoor game, we're going to have continuing games. The other is, of course, the side activity he came up with, which is the main objective of this thing is still to defeat the evil Egg of Coot who's invading the Duchy of Blackmoor. But as part of improving your character, I'm also going to create a dungeon below Castle Blackmoor that players can explore to accumulate treasure. We don't have a very good explanation from Arneson as to why he decided to do this. I wish we did. He'd been interviewed over the years. He died in 2009, died relatively young in 2009. He's only born in 47. He's given interviews over the years, but I'm not satisfied with anything he's ever said. One time he said, well, I was going to use this castle miniature as the main Castle Blackmoor on the table, and the miniature was kind of small, and it felt constraining that was the entirety of the space, so I was like, so what if I had dungeon levels underneath it? Other times he said, I was binge-watching Hammer horror films, and a lot of these take place in these kind of tunnels and catacombs, and so, I was inspired to just start sketching out some catacombs while I was watching Hammer horror films. That is what caused me to do it. Then as well, there was a game played at Gen Con in 71 that did involve some mucking around in some sewers and doing combat, which maybe that also inspired him. We don't have a very satisfactory answer. Certainly the fact that Chainmail had a bunch of monsters in it probably also influenced him. It's like, there's all these cool monsters. How do I use these? It's like, I'll put them all in a dungeon, because the initial version of the dungeon under Blackmoor basically used all of the monsters from Chainmail to populate it, which were primarily from Tolkien.
We have a proper dungeon.
Exactly. So he created a dungeon. He created the first dungeon in the RPG sense. The players loved it. They really, really loved going into the dungeon and fighting monsters and avoiding traps and gathering treasure, which, since gold was equivalent to experience points in Blackmoor, meant that this was also causing their characters to become more powerful. They had so much fun doing this, they actually lost the game, because so many people were spending so much of their time going dungeon crawling that they actually kind of forgot to defeat the armies of the Egg of Coot.
That just gets back into our scope thing again. This smaller thing is more fun than the big thing. Just focus on that.
Blackmoor was overrun. It was conquered. They lost the game. But of course, they were already establishing this idea that the game doesn't end with one scenario, so it wasn't the end of the Blackmoor campaign. Instead, they retreated and became exiles in the swamp and slowly worked to regain control. Most of them did. Some of them were traitors and went and started working for the Egg of Coot. I mean, there's this whole role-playing thing going on with it. That's Blackmoor. There are some updates on it in the fanzines. Gygax is aware of what's going on. The dungeon crawling is so fun that another Twin Cities guy named Dave Magari even creates a board game that kind of distills the dungeon aspect of it into a board game. It's not an RPG. It's not a tabletop RPG because it is on a board. This stuff's all going on. And of course, he's in correspondence with Gygax. Arneson is, as he always is. And so he's telling him about this game. And then they have a fateful meeting, because Lake Geneva and the Twin Cities aren't that far from each other. They're like 4 or 5 hours, something like that. Arneson and Magari come down to Lake Geneva to demonstrate Blackmoor, to run a Blackmoor session, as well as to demonstrate Dungeons of Podakasha, the board game that Magari has made based on all of this. Gygax is once again instantly smitten. He loves it. He loves it so much that he basically starts his own Braunstein, or what you would more properly call a Blackmoor at this point, based on his great kingdom, World of Greyhawk. And he wants to publish Magari's game, because He's working for Gaiden Games, for Lowry's company, as a solicitor of product that Gaiden can publish because Gygax is so well connected. He wants to publish Magari's board game, and he would like to collaborate with Arneson to turn his Blackmoor rules and his Blackmoor system into an actual publishable set of rules that, again, would be published by Gaiden Games. Oh, Magari. That's fair. David Magari. Ethan correcting the pronunciation, as he often does, which I appreciate as well. So that's what begins this collaboration. Arneson is building a somewhat coherent system. It's not just bits and bobs and odds and ends, but he kind of only codifies rules as he needs them and then fits them in where it makes sense, as we talked about at the top. He's not really consciously trying to create a complete rule set. Now, Gygax is saying, let's systematize this. So Arneson has a bunch of rules and notes, the infamous notes that Gygax supporters might say, well, Arneson just had a bunch of notes. Gygax turned it into a game. But I mean, notes trivializes it because they're notes in the sense that they're not meant to be read as a coherent manuscript from start to finish. But there are fully thought out rules in this. It's not like it's just concepts of rules. They are rules. They're just not in manuscript form. So notes is how it's often referred to, particularly by Gygax, which is in one sense accurate, but is in another sense maybe a little unfair. He kind of gets together his notes, as we might call them, and sends them to Gygax, who starts systematizing them, just kind of putting them in order, maybe filling in a gap here and there where one exists, and adding way too many polearms, because Gygax clearly has a polearm fetish.
How many polearms are we talking here?
Well, I mean, you played AD&D 2nd edition.
I did. The books are behind me somewhere.
Do you remember how many polearms were in that player's handbook? Bardiches and guidarms and halberds and... that man has some strange... Yeah, I know there were more in 2nd edition, Ethan, but he did add some. I'm pretty sure there are some in OD&D. I mean, it's not as many as in 2nd edition. And I am exaggerating...
For dramatic effect?
A little bit for dramatic effect. I think it's funny how thoroughly obsessed with polearms Gygax apparently was. But yeah, he tucked in a few things here and there, and if there were other gaps, he would sometimes write to Arneson and ask Arneson for additional rules to fill in gaps. They're kind of building this thing mostly throughout 1973 is when this work is going on. Might have started a little bit in late 72, but it's mostly 1973 where this work is going on, with the intent of getting this published as a comprehensive rule system for this new kind of fantastic miniatures war game. They're not calling it an RPG, they're still calling it a war game. Even though it's all about individuals going into dungeons and killing monsters and getting loot and getting experience and going up in level, they're still marketing it at this point as a war game because there's no conception of a role-playing game. I mean, people are already playing them. The Braunsteins clearly are them. But there's no conception that such a game type actually exists, because it's new. The idea is to publish this war game through Gaiden Games. It's right in this period that Lowry had decided to pick up his roots and move everything to Maine. That move was expensive, and that was problematic for his business that was just kind of barely eking by anyway. Gaiden Games basically falls apart in this transition. It doesn't die right away, but it basically falls apart, and there's no way it would be able to publish a product like D&D. Ethan is reporting back that OD&D, which is the colloquial term that people use for original D&D, the original publication in 74, has polearm, halberd, lance, if that counts, and no, I don't think it counts, and pike. That's all you get in OD&D. Yes, that is not the, practically dozen versions that are in 2nd edition. But polearm, halberd, and pike is probably more than the average person cared about. I'm still going to say Gygax was obsessed.
Keep the narrative consistent.
That's right. All glory to the narrative. I mean, obviously, it gets way more out of control later. I mean, that's absolutely true. So at that point, Gary's already got the local connections, through his Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association, and he decides, well, if Gaiden Games can't do this, I'll found my own company with polearms and hookers. So he joins with his childhood friend, Danny Kaye, not that Danny Kaye, and founds a company by the name of Tactical Studies Rules, a partnership between Gygax and Kay, taking the name partially from the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association and often abbreviated even in the early days. Yeah, it's Donald. Yeah, it's Don Kay, not Danny Kay. Danny Kay is that Danny Kay. Very famous. Don Kay is Gygax's childhood friend. I knew that. But thank you, Ethan, for the real-time Department of Corrections. I thought there was something wrong with it as I said it. Then I didn't check, and that was bad of me. Don Kay and Gary Gygax found Tactical Studies Rules with the intent of publishing D&D, but there's no way they'll be able to publish D&D right away because it's going to be expensive. Most of these rule sets are like rules booklets, single booklets. D&D has mushroomed into 3 separate booklets plus a variety of companion sheets for this and that. So it's going to have to be a boxed set, and that takes a lot of money to get going, much more than a simple rules pamphlet. So the idea is that they'll publish some miniatures rules, some wargaming rules that will generate the money they need to publish D&D. The first one they do is Cavaliers and Roundheads, which is a English Civil War rule set. They do 1 or 2 others in there as well. Yeah, then hopefully they'll publish D&D the next year. Well, those early rule sets don't do very well. Not a lot of clamoring for English Civil War's rules. So, I mean, they're kind of scraping by, but they're not getting the money together to be able to publish this game. So at the very end of the year, like in December, I think, of 73, yeah, it was the only 73 product. I think Tractics or whatever it's called was published around the same time as well, but around the same time as D&D. But yeah, Cavaliers and Roundheads was the only 73 product because, I mean, TSR, Tactical Studies Rules, was only founded in like October or something like that. Yeah, the end of the year. But they had plans to do other things. They were talking about publishing Fight the Skies. They were talking about publishing Tractics. Like, there's a lot of stuff in the air, but that's the one thing that got published. So they end up in December bringing a third partner, Brian Bloom, who was also an avid wargamer, who was a member of the LGTSA, whose family had a little more money. So they bring in Brian Bloom to be able to finance actually creating this thing. So in late January, it really officially goes on sale in February, but a few copies trickle out in January 1974. We get this boxed set, Dungeons and Dragons, for a whopping $10.
Only $10? I wish I could do that now.
Yeah, though in fairness, $10 in 1974 money, before stagflation completely redefined America's relationship with money. Ethan says in the chat, $10, what a ripoff. And he's saying that deliberately because he knows. Because, yeah, there were a lot of people unhappy about that. There were a lot of people that were like, $10 for a set of miniatures rules? That's ludicrous. Yeah, there was some unrest. I mean, there were people that just didn't like fantasy games that were like, what the heck? There were other people that were like, $10, what the heck?
Inflation calculator says that $10 in 1973 is $70.82 today.
Yeah.
That is a lot.
That is a lot. Like, that's what a PlayStation 5 game costs today.
Give or take, yes. After taxes and whatever else.
Uh-huh. It was a lot. And, it was a lot for something that didn't necessarily have a lot of perceived value back then. Because, like I said, the military miniatures community in particular was very fandom-driven. It was very, like, what we would call indie today. Stuff's not being printed on the highest quality paper. It's not being bound with the highest quality binding. The rules are kind of seen as a necessary adjunct. The real thing you're buying and enjoying is the miniatures. It's just you have to have this sheet of rules to be able to play with them. Kind of just like, how in the early computer industry, it's like you were buying the hardware and the software was the throw-in. Nobody saw value in software. You're buying the miniatures, and the rules are the throw-in, sometimes just printed for free in fanzines. I mean, you're paying a subscription for the fanzine, but you're not paying an additional cost for the rules, or something that you're buying very cheaply in a hobby shop. To make the rules the centerpiece of what you're buying by making them that expensive, that's ridiculous. Yeah, as Esamoliva says, miniatures and miniature accessories. The miniatures were the thing, the rules were like the accessories, the add-on. This is taking the rules and putting them front and center. People are still thinking in terms of war games. because it even calls itself a war game on the box. So for a set of war game rules, that truly was considered highway robbery at that price. Fair enough. I've never watched King of the Hill.
I have. I got the reference.
So I did not understand that reference. I get no points. Jeffrey gets points.
Yay, points.
The rules were pretty impossible to decipher. They were spread across 3 books. The organization across those 3 books wasn't necessarily always logical. So you're flipping back and forth between these 3 books. Most of the combat is still going to be adjudicated by chainmail. So you actually have to have a copy of chainmail in addition to D&D if you really actually want to play this game. Plus, for overworld encounters, which are kind of de-emphasized, I mean, it's called Dungeons and Dragons. It's not called Dungeons and Prairies or Dungeons and Forests. They kind of de-emphasize the overworld, but the overworld portions to move around in the wilderness requires a completely separate SPI game. Board Wargaming Company is a competitor to Avalon Hill in order to, do that part of it. That part of it wasn't strictly necessary because, like I said, that was kind of de-emphasized compared to the dungeoneering. But if you wanted to take part in that part of the game, then you needed a third game. So the rules were kind of incoherent in a lot of ways. They weren't fully thought out, despite the fact that Gygax's job was to systematize Arneson's rulemaking that he was kind of doing on an ad hoc basis. He didn't necessarily do that great a job of even doing that systematizing. So people that were just seeing these rules were like, what the hell?
I guess the miniatures are okay, but these rules make no sense.
Yeah, how is this even a war game?
What war game is this? How do I war with this? Go in a dungeon? Am I declaring war on the earth?
But this is the point where Gygax's other kind of activities are crucial to spreading this game. And, another part of why you don't have this without both Gygax and Arneson. Because the rules were nonsense. But if somebody walked you through, just like, don't worry about the rule books, but actually just walked you through playing this darn thing, then the light bulb went off. And that's really the way D&D is today. I mean, even when they have more comprehensive, and all RPGs, even when Pathfinder and GURPS and D&D and all of these others have comprehensive sets of rules today that do a better job of plugging in all the holes, how do most groups start? One person brings the game and is just like, don't worry about the rules. Let's just sit down and start playing.
We don't have to worry about it. We aren't even pressing A. I will press A for you, and we will just start playing. Alex, you find yourself in a basement in front of a microphone. It is still bright outside, and there might be some balls playing and the sound of birds. You're not sure what's going on, but a strange smell assails the area. What do you do?
I attempt to locate the source of the smell?
Well, on your character sheet, you have a search smell button, or search smells die. And you need to roll that in order to find out what's going on. And I have already set a DC for you, a difficulty class, that will determine whether or not you succeed or fail. So go ahead and roll a d20 and add in your stat points and your skill at smelling.
Now I hear a cat. I want to make a perception roll to locate cat.
Now you have to do find cat skill, which is a perception check, and roll that d20 plus perception plus I really want to find a cat.
Indeed. So, quite frankly, that's the way Jeff and I were introduced to D&D. Our friend Ben, he didn't even have the player's handbook.
No, he did not.
He just had the Forgotten Realms campaign setting box set. So we were barely even doing anything that even resembled D&D rules. I mean, we were not, for all intents and purposes, playing D&D in that first session.
Not really, no.
Which was fine. It didn't matter.
No, we had fun. Nice little things that wanted me to drink a nice drink and become one of them. But I didn't know that. But I was a polite person who drank their drink.
That was not actually the first one, but I remember that one. That was a couple of Yuan Ti that were trying to convince him to become a Hitachi, which was their servitor creatures. That was a good time, too. That was also not strictly adhering to the rules of D&D. I mean, it was part of the same kind of continuum. It just wasn't the very first session, but I remember that. Because I was playing the other Yuan Ti, and Ben and I kept talking. It's like, oh, he would make good Histashi. Yes, good Histashi. You drink, you become good Histashi. And Jeff's like, oh, well, why? Yeah, good Histashi. Good times. But yeah, we weren't even playing by the rules, but that didn't matter because the cool thing is we were creating a story together. I mean, we were in middle school and he hadn't thought stuff out in advance. I mean, it wasn't like a great campaign or a memorable story or anything, but that wasn't the point. As middle schoolers, we had never done anything like this before. I mean, you just sit around and you all have a character and like you say what you're going to do and then something happens. It's like the possibilities are endless. I mean, I remember it was a sleepover, so we played late into the night, and I just remember personally just getting more and more jazzed as we kept going because it's like, this is so cool.
It is interesting how it went. And then I remember just sort of how did we get from point A to point B and like, okay, I'm a Yutashi and I guess I'm some sort of servitor now or whatever. Then we had to fight some sort of armor, and it was really, really hard to fight the armor.
Yeah.
I think what really cemented D&D for me was actually when I visited you in Germany.
Yeah.
We played with that gentleman, and I was playing Billy the Rogue.
Yeah, so we had tried at various points to kind of get D&D off the ground in middle school and early high school. Our friend John Lewis tried some things. Our friend Ben left after 8th grade, so he introduced us to all of this and then, left. So then with our friend John Lewis, we were trying to get things going, and our friend Pat Quinn, we tried experimenting like with running something here and there, but never really got it off the ground. And yeah, this was all 2nd edition, Ethan. This would have been probably starting in 1995, maybe, give or take. So yeah, it was all 2nd edition. Then I moved to Germany and fell in with a group there, my friend Nick there, who his father had been introduced to D&D while he was back in college. And so, as Nick liked to say, he started killing player characters when he was 3 years old because his dad would have friends over and, he'd be there and his dad would let him roll the dice sometimes, kind of deal. He wasn't playing the game. But, he was around. And so he grew up with it, and he got a group going that primarily played at lunchtime at the high school, but then we would also continue to play in the summer and whatnot. We'd do longer sessions on the weekend in summer, but we did a lot of the playing in high school. Nick was the best pure, combat runner, rules runner that I have ever played with because he knew the rules backward and forward. And his family, they used a hybrid. It was kind of mostly 1st edition, but with the things from 2nd edition that you really wanted to have, like Thaco. We weren't using hit charts from 1st edition. So it was a 1st edition, 2nd edition hybrid. And before him, his father had been doing this so long that he just had these huge piles of index cards of NPCs. So we might do like a siege where we're inside a castle and the castle is under siege. So it'll be like, okay, those siege ladders have come up and there are 5 guys on the wall with you. And he would just take 5 index cards from his huge set of index cards. Bam, 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 bam. These are the 5 guys that are on the wall with your party now. He was really good at running combat, especially good at running combat. And yeah, Jeff came over to visit me and, we played during the summer, which is when Jeff visited. So he sat in on a few sessions. And that's when, as Jeff said, AD&D really clicked for him. And then he went back and started a group that finally stuck with our friends back in Illinois. In high school, I almost never played with my friends. I came back and visited and was a guest character and got killed within 5 minutes of the adventure starting.
Oh, come on. It was fun. I liked that trap. There was a room that was sealed off, and if you listened to the dancing skeletons in there, they would charm you and have you dance with them and you would die eventually. Alex succeeded at his rogue's listen roll, so he heard it.
Yeah, listening check. This was 3rd edition by this time, I believe. It was skill checks. I had a really good listening ability.
Yep.
I was a gnome rogue.
So he listened, he heard it, it was great, he won, and then he failed his charm. And then he failed the 2nd charm. And then he failed the 3rd resist thing. Then he failed the 4th thing, and he died.
Yes, I was the only one that succumbed to that trap, and it was one of the very first encounters, so, I died right at the start of the adventure in my little guest starring. So, I played with our high school friends later, in college and after college when we'd come back, but I never played with them in high school because I was in Germany, though I had my own group in Germany. I was playing the entire time, we were separate paths then. to get back to the point of that, like, that's the magic, is sitting around a table and just playing. I mean, you need somebody, preferably the DM, who knows what they're doing, but you become enraptured by D&D and other RPGs by just doing it, not by reading pages and pages and pages of rules, especially pages and pages and pages of nonsensical rules, like in the original D&D released in 1974. Two things really aided the early spread of D&D. First of all, Gygax was a prolific writer in all the fanzines, as we talked about. As a way of publicizing D&D, he would write recaps of game sessions, because that's the other thing that could really interest you in this game if you didn't have the opportunity to play it with a group. You know, he would provide these kind of recaps of games, and it would be like, this is crazy. This person said they were going to do this, and then they did that, and what? What kind of rule system lets you do that?
Yeah. Another thing is I really got in, especially at the time, into a comic book or a comic series called Knights of the Dinner Table, where it delves into this. They play a fictional game of D&D called Hackmaster. You got a bunch of crazy nerds sitting around a dinner table and going all these shenanigans and adventure stuff, and it's just a wild ride of silliness. It still goes on even today, if I recall correctly. It's just interesting to see these different kinds of how do you approach role-playing. What kind of magic and creativity can come from it.
That does not surprise me that Carl is a big fan of Knights of the Dinner Table, just because he's very into the whole comics scene, as well as D&D and all of this other stuff. Yeah, if you watch any of this in retrospective, Carl, shout out to Knights of the Dinner Table just for you, Carl. Just for you.
I got a bunch of the old comics going up to about episode 200.
Hey, we got another fan here. Aaron, big fan of Knights of the Dinner Table. I read some of them, and I liked them. But I didn't, Jeff actually has a lot of the graphic novels. He was actually collecting that stuff. I enjoyed reading it, like, here and there and, catching something and whatnot. But yeah.
I fell out of it after a while, but it's just like for maybe a good 3-4 years there, I had an ongoing subscription to them and this, that, and the other thing. And the problem now to catch up with it is like, I have all this past lore, then I have this jumping time, and then whatever's going on now, it's harder to get back into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Knights at the Dinner Table, good shout out there. So that started to publicize it a little bit. And then, of course, Gary Gygax happens to have what is essentially, I'm oversimplifying slightly, but is essentially his own personal wargaming convention. Little thing called Gen Con. And in fact, by this time, it's actually being run by TSR because the IFW fell apart and then the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association took over for 1 year. And actually, it was the success in running that led Gygax to believe maybe he could found his own publisher too. So TSR is actually running the thing by this point. So at Gen Con 7 in 1974, in August, so it's the first Gen Con after D&D was released, of course, one of the big focuses at Gen Con is live D&D sessions, many of them run by Gary Gygax himself. So that causes the game to begin to spread. Because people come to Gen Con, they play it, they become enamored by it, they buy copies of it, which TSR helpfully has available, for the low, low price of $10. Then they take them back to their local wargaming groups and are like, this is this amazing game that I played. Now we're going to play it. And that person becomes the evangelist. They probably still don't have a great grasp on the rules because they only played it once or twice or observed it being played once or twice at Gen Con. But then they become the new evangelist and they introduce their group to it. And then they become enamored with it and it just spreads. Of course, there are all of these fanzines that are done by these various groups, and so then these people start writing their own reviews and their own recaps of games. You see, there's a slight overlap, as we said, between fantasy aficionados and wargamers. It's not a completely great pairing, but there's also a huge overlap between science fiction and fantasy aficionados and the idea of role-playing. We're not going to get too deeply into this, but you have other groups that have nothing to do with wargaming that are doing things that are a little like role-playing. There's this science fiction and fantasy club in Los Angeles that is running this quote-unquote game called Coventry. that is basically a bunch of people sitting around and inhabiting characters and doing role-playing. There's another game called Midgard, I think, that's kind of doing something similar. And then, of course, you have the Society for Creative Anachronism, which basically go around pretending that they're living in medieval times and set up nobility and get together and have feasts and tournaments and all of this other stuff. These groups didn't have a comprehensive rule system that encompassed what they were doing. But members of these groups would get introduced to D&D by some person, one of these overlap people. There were only a few individuals that were at the intersection between miniatures wargaming and other sci-fi and fantasy fandoms. But then those individuals introduced those rules to their friends in those fandoms because this really crossed over. This is a game that truly crossed over because a lot of the wargaming people, not all wargaming people liked it because it was not a traditional wargame, but if you were a wargaming person, you might be attracted to it as a rule system for simulating this particular type of battle and exploration. Whereas if you're part of this science fiction fantasy fandom, you're interested in it for its ability to allow you to assume a character and tell stories through that character. So it had real crossover appeal amongst different parts of fandom that allowed it to spread beyond just the role-playing community and allowed to get wrapped up in some of these other types of games that were going on, like Midgard and Coventry, that were kind of like role-playing games in a way, just without the stats and without the rolling of dice and without the game mechanics. It kind of met at the intersection of these areas, so it became really popular within these circles within a short amount of time. Now, remember, we're talking about really niche circles. So really popular within these circles doesn't mean that it's really popular with the general public. But they're selling, a few hundred units a month, a few thousand units a year, or whatever. They're getting some steady enough sales to kind of keep this thing going. At this point, it's mostly, in the first few years, it's probably college age and, maybe a few people a little bit older and just a little bit younger, but kind of college age, I think, is the crux. And the reason for that just comes down, I think, to the wargaming hobby in general, because for wargaming, you need a few things. First of all, you need a decent amount of spare time on your hands, because you're having to collect these miniatures, paint these miniatures, set up your table with the specific campaign that you're going, or battle that you're going to be doing, and then the battles themselves take a long time to play out. You need a fair amount of time on your hands. You also need a fair amount of space on your hands, because you need a place where you can set up the table or multiple tables and have everyone gathered around in order to play. Then the other thing is you're probably a bit of a bookworm, scholarly, nerdy type, because people tend to be attracted to this because of their interest in history and their interest in various types of military units. It's not that you have to be like a super genius to play these games. It's just that you probably have a little bit more of a scholarly, nerdy bent if you're attracted to this. If you don't know the difference between a hussar, a cuirassier, and a lancer, you are probably not doing Napoleonic wargaming. The vast majority of the general public, quite frankly, does not care about the difference between a hussar, a cuirassier, and a lancer. Obviously, it's not all college students. You do have some older adults that maybe have a job that affords them enough free time, and they own their own home with a basement that they can invite friends over to. I mean, obviously, Gary Gygax was not a college student in this time period, though Dave Arneson was for much of it. But college students tend to have more time. College students tend to be people who kind of like knowledge and are kind of nerdy sometimes. Not all college students. I'm not generalizing here, but, that's a trait that some college students have. College students had the time. They had the concentration of people of similar age and interests all gathered in one place, and they had the university facilities where they could set up their games and they could become official clubs. You could have a wargaming club at the university and that kind of thing. So a lot of this was happening with college students, and you had a few other, older people, and you also had a few precocious high school students that were hanging on. But I think the average age kind of averaged out to college age kind of students. So a lot of this stuff, which is going to become important in the third and, I repeat, final episode. So a lot of this stuff was happening in college campuses at this time at first. maybe trickling out a little bit from there, but largely a lot of the major activity was at colleges. This persisted for the first couple of years until TSR, which, not to get into corporate shenanigans too much, but in 1975 reorganized as a corporation called TSR Hobbies when Donald Kay, very tragically, died quite suddenly of a heart attack. I mean, he was only in his 30s. He died of a heart attack. His early 30s at that, born in 1938, and we're talking 1974 or 75 when he died. Then the Bloom family bought out Donald Kay's widow's shares of the company, and then they reorganized it as TSR Hobbies Incorporated. In the middle of the decade, TSR Hobbies Incorporated took a concerted effort to make a coherent rule system out of this, because for the first couple of years following up on D&D, they released additional supplements to that original box set. The first one of these came out in 75 was World of Greyhawk, and you would think, based on the modern conception of campaign settings, that a book called World of Greyhawk would be about the Great Kingdom and this setting of Greyhawk. But in fact, there's very little of that in there. It's mostly just filling in a bunch of rules that were missing from the OD&D box set. It's pretty crunchy. They released like an Eldritch Wizardry book and a Sword and Sorcery book like Deities and Demigods. They released a bunch of supplements to this thing that were kind of trying to plug the holes in the original Dungeons and Dragons. They were gaining traction and they were selling well. They were having some success with that. But then in 1977, they started a process of completely redoing things and creating a more coherent system instead of this kludge that they had where a box set plus several supplements plus random articles in Dragon Magazine and its predecessor, the Strategic Review, constituted the rules. I mean, it was kind of the Wild West, which in a way was good because that's a lot of the reason why there were competing role-playing games that even appeared. Because a lot of the early competitors that appeared, like Bunnies and Burrows and Tunnels and Trolls and RuneScape and whatnot, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, just started out with individual clubs creating their own D&D variations to either suit their playstyle better or fill in holes where they saw holes in the original rules. And then these variations grew into full-fledged systems that then published themselves. The messy incompleteness of D&D was probably important to the spread of the concept of the role-playing game as being a genre as opposed to D&D being a one-off. But on the other hand, it was inhibiting its acceptance by the wider community. D&D was never going to go mainstream when it remained an impenetrable mess. Some particularly nerdy people were going to get into that, and they might be able to get a few slightly less nerdy people into it by saying, don't worry, I'll explain all the rules to you, just go with it. But you're not really going to get mainstream acceptance of Dungeons & Dragons in this way. So they start a plan to fundamentally revise Dungeons & Dragons and make it more accessible, and they do this through a two-pronged approach. First of all, they commission a new version of basic Dungeons & Dragons, a new version of the original 1974 release that is far better organized and thought out and fills in gaps, incorporates some stuff from supplements that came afterwards to create a more consistent experience. They see this new version of basic Dungeons & Dragons as basically being an introduction to the concept of D&D and role-playing games. It's really meant to just guide you through the first 3 levels or so of play. Which, back then, there's been a lot of progression inflation over time. Back then, that was a lot more game playing, and, half the challenge was just getting through the first level without dying. A lot of early dungeon crawls were just death traps.
So many death traps.
Complete and other death traps. They were going to have this new version of basic Dungeons & Dragons, and then to take you forward from there, they were going to have a big new set of shiny rules divided into 3 big volumes sold separately. Original D&D had been in 3 booklets, but they were all part of one box set. This would be 3 big books sold separately. To differentiate this from the introductory game, Basic Dungeons & Dragons, they were going to call this Advanced Dungeons & Dragons.
Advanced, you say? How advanced?
Well, Thaco goes up and armor class goes down. Lots of math.
So much math.
Indeed. With the first release coming in 1977 to be the Player's Handbook, and then followed by the other books, the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster's Manual, the big 3. They didn't come out all at once. They came out over a period of years, unlike in later editions. But it's always been the big three. So yeah, it's always been the big three ever since the original version of AD&D. Obviously, once there was no longer a basic Dungeons & Dragons, putting that advanced in front of it was a bit anachronistic and also a bit confusing to people, almost feeling like they shouldn't buy that because it's for people who already have experience with Dungeons & Dragons. So with 3rd edition, they went back to D&D. But ever since 1st edition AD&D, it's always been those big three books that kick things off every edition: the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster's Manual. And it was no different with AD&D. Released in 77, 78, etc. I think that the codification of the rules in this way, in a more coherent structure, that were not quite so impenetrable, especially with this idea of having the basic thing you could start with and then moving on up to the bigger thing, allowed the game to start trending a little younger, because a funny thing happened, and this is according to TSR's own demographic research, which Peterson had access to when he wrote his book Game Wizards on the history of TSR. A funny thing started happening around 1978, is that the age of the average player started getting much, much younger. It wasn't college students and 20, 30-year-old nerds that were playing this game anymore. It was high school students and even younger than that. It was even like a lot of middle schoolers. Obviously, the 80s nostalgia-fueled show Stranger Things integrates Dungeons & Dragons very much into its ongoing plot and stories. That set of kids start out as a group of middle school students. Now, in the last season, there'll be a bunch of 25-year-olds pretending they're high school students, but that's a whole other story. Stranger Things, depicts this group of middle schoolers that's really into this game, and that's really accurate. There's a shift that happens right in here, starting in 78 and moving into the early 80s, towards a much younger audience for the game. And the second part of that is fueled for reasons that we're going to talk about in a second. But the first part of that, I think, had to come from just a more coherent and consistent set of rules that was easier for new players to get into. Because that new basic D&D set was a really well-done thing, and then there was a lot of thought that went into the AD&D books graduating up from there. You have this demographic shift that comes, and that's fueling a little better sales, but it's still just kind of going along. I mean, the company's doing fine. The company's okay, but it's still pretty small time on the whole. It's still pretty obscure. Then there's a little disappearance that happens with a teenaged, 16-year-old precocious college student up in Michigan by the name of James Dallas Egbert III. This is really the point in 1979 when the D&D story goes into overdrive. So, like I said, James Egbert was this very smart guy. He was in college at 16 years old at Michigan State University. But as probably shouldn't be that great a surprise, considering how being a prodigy can come associated with a lot of other social problems, he had some real issues with depression and loneliness and unrealistic expectations from his parents and all of this kind of baggage. That's sad. I mean, it's tragic. The pressure of it all got to him in August 1979. He decided to run off to parts unknown for reasons unknown. We know them now. We'll tell the story chronologically, but he vanished from his dorm. The police were kind of at a loss, and his parents brought in this private investigator who was a real kind of self-aggrandizing character by the name of William Deere. While I do think that Deere was legitimate in obviously trying to locate Egbert, because, he's working for the parents and they're not going to pay him if he's not doing anything, he was also very much into self-promotion, and he saw that this was going to be a major story. Teenage computer science prodigy disappears from college dorm. He did a lot of self-aggrandizing, self-promoting things as part of his investigation. flying over the campus in his airplane, doing searches and constantly speaking to the press, doing lots of stunts like that. One thing that became clear in the course of the investigation is that Egbert had from time to time played Dungeons and Dragons. Remember, this is still incredibly niche, Dungeons and Dragons. TSR is doing fine, and they've sold several tens of thousands of units at this point, probably. But they are still small potatoes. Most people have no idea what the heck Dungeons and Dragons is. Egbert's parents don't know what it is. The local police don't know what it is. Deere doesn't know what it is. So they come to learn eventually that it's this. So at first they don't even realize it's actually a commercial product. This is going to change in a couple of years, as we'll get to in a second. But at this time, you couldn't just walk into your local mainstream bookstore and buy a copy of Dungeons and Dragons. This was being sold via mail order. It was being sold via hobby shops. It was not being sold in mainstream venues. So at first, when the local police heard about this Dungeons and Dragons thing, they thought this was something that Egbert and his friends had made up themselves. They didn't even realize it was a real commercial product.
Yeah. Then, of course, because they think it's something they made up, they're going to jump to their own conclusions. They're going to jump to their own things and pretty much bark off the Satanic Panic.
They originally think that this has something to do with some cult, and they take some things really out of context. Like he had this bulletin board in his room, just an ordinary tack board. The pins on that board, some of the pins seemed like they were arranged to depict a dungeon map. I'm not sure if they actually were. I mean, they might have been using it for that, though they might have just been in that pattern. Then there were other pins off to the side that were very clearly just pins that were randomly stuck into the board that nobody was using. So they kind of got this idea that this map was a clue to the disappearance and that the pattern of the pins meant something. Deere, because he senses a story here, he's just making shit up left and right. And he's like, oh yeah, the organization of the pins here in the board represents the beginning state of the game. And as the game moves on, more complex patterns are created. This may be the clue as to where James Egbert has been hiding.
That is very true. Chief Wiggum did make the same mistake.
Yeah, exactly. This is right out of Chief Wiggum's playbook. Make 'em away, toys.
What?
Just do what the kid said. So, of course, this case is attracting the media scrutiny that Deere sensed it was going to attract. So now there's all this talk about how he was playing this strange game, Dungeons and Dragons. Of course, they figure out it's an actual commercial product made by this small company in Lake Geneva called TSR. Like, kids are getting addicted to this thing, and it's becoming a cult, and they're having trouble distinguishing fantasy from reality. It also kind of came out that Egbert liked exploring. There was a system of steam tunnels under Michigan State, as there were under a lot of old college campuses, old infrastructure. You know, Stanford is very famous for its steam tunnels. It came out that Egbert also liked exploring the steam tunnels, which is something that college kids, I mean, it wasn't a common pastime, but it was something that college kids at campuses with these old steam tunnels would do, as they would treat it as a form of spelunking and go exploring, which could potentially be somewhat dangerous. Then they got this mixed up with the fact that, oh, they were playing D&D in the steam tunnels. And maybe that's what happened to him, is he got in the steam tunnels playing the game, and he's still down there, you know, alive or dead or whatever. So they got that all conflated too. So they start getting this national media coverage. Originally, the media coverage is somewhat negative, because it is this, oh, you know, boy disappears playing game with cult kind of thing. But after a period of time, Egbert is discovered. He is discovered down in Louisiana. He had actually decided, he had resolved to kill himself. I mean, it's a tragic story. I would never make light of that. He had resolved to kill himself. He, I guess, decided that he should go far away from his home to do it. You know, that's the length of the country, Michigan to Louisiana. He had attempted to kill himself by ingesting something, had failed, and I think it's Louisiana, but we will fact check. Yes, Morgan City, Louisiana. He failed and then just decided, you know, he still didn't want to go back home. I think he was feeling a lot of pressure of being this prodigy. He just kind of wanted to vanish. So he decided, well, I failed to kill myself, but I'm still not going back to that life. So he took a job working on oil rigs in Louisiana, just as a oil field worker, a laborer. And that's where he was finally discovered. Now, Deere never officially retracted all of the stuff, all of the nonsense that he was saying about D&D, but he wrote a book about it. The Dungeon Master got turned into a fictional book, and then it got turned into a ridiculous movie starring a young Tom Hanks, Mazes and Monsters, about a kid who can't distinguish between the fantasy of the game and reality and all of this. But that track actually died down. Like, once the kid was found and most people could realize that it was not D&D that did this, the whole D&D is evil thing died down in this moment in 79. We'll get back to the rest of it. But the media was still fascinated by it because this case still led a lot of journalists in the mainstream media to discover this thing. And it was very interesting because it was so different than any other game out there. After the initial panicky, it's a cult, people die in the game and die for real kind of stuff, there started to be a lot of coverage about, hey, there's this really interesting new game out there called Dungeons and Dragons that is like nothing you have ever played before. So it started getting just publicity, not negative publicity anymore, just legitimate publicity. This legitimate publicity attracted the attention of Random House, the major book publisher. Random House was like, oh my gosh, this was amazing, and this sounds amazing, and you say it comes in books? So Random House, as a result of this Egbert publicity, according to Peterson, contacted TSR, and TSR worked out a distribution deal with Random House, and Random House started putting it in mainstream bookstores. Now, the general public could find it, and the mainstream media was covering it, and sales of D&D and AD&D, the new one that was already out by this time as well, just shot into the stratosphere. They hit the big time, and this is the period of time when it also became a licensing juggernaut. You know, in the early 80s, move on a couple of years from this is when we get the D&D cartoon as a Saturday morning cartoon. Mattel, you know, there's this hot new thing called the video game industry that's gaining some popularity, and so TSR does a deal with Mattel to put out D&D related games on the Intellivision system. The licensing is entirely like, oh, there's big money out here. Like, Gygax and his people are not computer nerds. Arneson, interestingly enough, later becomes one, but he's not really one at this time. By this time, Arneson did briefly join TSR in 1976. He was not a co-founder. Hear that, Strong Museum? He was not a co-founder. But he did join briefly in 76. He got some stock, a very small amount of stock. It was enough to allow him to attend shareholder meetings and continue feuding for years to come. Yeah, first mention of video games, like 2 hours into the second 2-hour episode. It's like, what is this podcast about?
No one knows.
Oh, yeah, it's about recoring fruit, right? That's what we decided. It's about recoring fruit.
Recoring fruit.
Yes, live recoring, and they create worlds. Or maybe we're recoring planets. Maybe we're installing new cores into planets, and that's how we create worlds, is by recoring worlds.
That could be very true. We could be making all those planets like Slarty Bartfest.
Yeah. So, you know, nobody at TSR was actually particularly interested in computer games and video games. Mattel Electronics wants to come to them and offers them a lot of money to put D&D on Intellivision. Yeah, go ahead. Put D&D on Intellivision. The TSR people aren't interested in computer games or what's going on there because that's small potatoes. The computer game industry is minuscule. Avalon Hill, interestingly enough, decides that they're going to try to get into this new video game industry. TSR's like, who cares? There's no money in that. Like, we'll let Mattel do electronic handhelds and video games and all of this because they're paying us for it. Ah, yes. We do love our Hitchhiker's Guide at They Create Worlds. It is not uncommon. We haven't really had much in the way of Hitchhiker's references in these episodes, but it's not uncommon for us to have Hitchhiker's references in this show. So they weren't in the video games, but now D&D is becoming mainstream by the beginning of the 1980s, which comes with its own problems, because that's where you get the actual Satanic Panic backlash. Like, the Egbert thing wasn't really based around Satanic Panic stuff. That was just kid disappears, was playing this weird game nobody'd heard of, maybe there's a connection. But now you have middle school and high school students all over the country that are taking up the game in bigger and bigger and bigger numbers. you have parents, teachers, grandparents starting to notice this in conservative outposts in places like Utah, for example, which is where one of the earliest complaints came from. So now you have, in the early 80s, you start having a tip back in the other direction where D&D is in the news all the time again, but it's about it being satanic. You know, they say all publicity is good publicity, and there was some benefit to just being in the news, but they also did start to see a slowing of their sales a little bit in the early to mid-1980s that could partially be attributed probably to this whole satanic panic situation. I mentioned this in text in Twitch chat near the beginning of everything here, but just to get it in the episode as well. One of the funniest of these that Peterson recounts is this grandmother who learned that her grandkid and friends were playing this Dungeons and Dragons thing that she heard was Satan's game. Oh, wow. Yeah. Outer Organism sharing in chat. I wasn't allowed to play Dungeons and Dragons because my parents thought it would open a portal to hell. Yeah, I mean, the Satanic Panic, people were serious about this. It wasn't just like, we think this is going to lead you into a bad crowd and lead you to do drugs. They thought you were literally selling your soul to the devil and you were going to become a witch and you were going to, like, bring about the apocalypse or something. For more religious types, this was serious. Super serious.
I will include into the show notes some examples of this. There's actually a comic that was put out by some religious thing saying about how bad D&D was and how it led to children offing themselves or whatever because they lost a character in there. It's just like, no, none of this happened, really. You had a bunch of insanity going on where you actually had a group around it. You know how you have MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There's actually a group called Mothers Against Dungeons and Dragons. Really?
Yeah.
Why? I think this really speaks to a problem that we have that's only, I think, gotten more prevalent as things have gotten on in the world, where people just read the headlines and take it as gospel, as opposed to checking the original source, checking what is being claimed, and see if that really is the case.
Oh, yeah.
Do your own research. Trust but verify what's being told to you.
Yeah.
There's a lot of times where all these parents went, why is my kid into this Dungeons and Dragons thing? It's all about summoning demons or whatever. You probably get more of that out of Solomon's Key than when you do out of Dungeons and Dragons.
Sorry, I was just going to say it because it's a perfect segue. That dovetails right into the story that I was about to tell because, you know, this panic takes hold. And so this grandmother hears that her grandson and their friends are doing this. She resolves that she's going to go and see what's going on and what perversion they're getting up to. So she sits in on the session. And after a little while, she just kind of says very huffily, "This is just math." And then storms out and leaves them alone.
Right. And really, that is what Dungeons and Dragons is. It's just a bunch of math to resolve conflict and challenges. You do your story, you're advancing on. I want to unlock this door. Here's the math you have to do to unlock the door. I want to fight the orc. Here's the math you do to fight the orc. I want to build a ship. This is the math I do to build a ship.
Yep.
There's a lot of it where it's just, hey, investigate what it is that seems bad and off that you want to be righteous against.
Indeed.
Check your sources. Check your sources. Make sure that what is being claimed is there's always something that's going to be, we must rise up against X because so-and-so is evil or not. Understand why.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with you, Aaron. I mean, the grandmother took the right approach. I find it all a bit silly to have some of those worries in the first place, but of course, this was brand new at the time. So, I mean, you can understand why. I mean, the pure satanic stuff is a bit much for me, but you can understand why the kids are suddenly getting together in the basement and doing God knows what that you don't understand, that you'd want to look at it. I mean, I don't think that grandparent is guilty of anything particularly bad. I agree that it's good that rather than just saying you can't do this, she decided to see what it was before condemning it. I agree with that 100%. I find the punchline just so funny. She's like, this is just math. It's like good times. Just to kind of recap there. So D&D is published in 74. It gains traction in certain circles, 75, 76, largely passing through word of mouth, either through recaps of gameplay sessions in fanzines or through people being guided through games, whether that's at Gen Con or Origins, which we haven't really talked about, but it was the other major gaming convention at that time. Before D&D hit the stratosphere, was actually the larger of the two game conventions. Of course, both still exist today, Origins and Gen Con. Either playing it there and becoming enamored with it, grew slowly and steadily. A revision of the rules helped a younger generation get into it at the end of the 70s, right before a highly sensationalized story about Mr. Egbert, who did tragically then die in 1980, not long after he was found. He didn't last long. It is a tragic story. Shot through the roof. It got mainstream distribution and attracted mainstream interest from children, middle school, high school students from all walks of life at this point. And then started getting a little bit of a backlash from the Satanic Panic that was really starting up in the early 1980s. That kind of sets the scene for where Dungeons & Dragons and TSR were in the larger public consciousness in the late 70s and early 80s, and kind of the first 6, 7, 8 years after Dungeons & Dragons launched in January of 1974. So with that context in mind, in our third and final episode, we will look at how in this same period, parallel to the growth of Dungeons & Dragons, the game itself, amongst different segments of the population, we're going to see the rise of the first computer games based on Dungeons & Dragons, and how many of those early games that came about in the 70s would influence a lot of what happened in video games in the early 1980s and beyond.
Amazing. We do 2 episodes and we haven't even talked about a video game yet.
We briefly mentioned the Intellivision games. I'll have you know, sir.
Oh, fine. Some sort of Intellivision games. Alex is out of Diet Dr. Pepper. I am out of Diet Coke. And thus, we must go on a grand quest together to go gather more of both. So we have to save versus thirst. Next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things that we discuss in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, The Story of the People and Companies That Shaped the Video Game Industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please feel free to like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License.